G'day, I'm Owen. This is the 17th and last video in the Jack the Ripper victim series. So after this one, there will be the whole lot put together in one long form video, which will be the next video being released. But if you have been watching them as they get released, let's get straight into it. So the last one that we are looking at happened a long time after the Pinchin Street mystery as well. We're talking 1891, so nothing officially happened in 1890 as regards Jack the Ripper victims. Now, I want to state that this is not saying that no bad things happened during that time, because they did, but the media and the police did not make any connection to Jack the Ripper crimes until this event happened, and it was to Frances Coles. Now, she was born in 1859 in September. Now, her family were not wealthy, but they seemed to make do. She was in gainful employment for a fair chunk of her life, and it would be safe to say she was a proud person as well, because she fell on difficult times and then ended up working the streets and living in the doss houses. Yet, and this is important to note, she hid that fact from her family. Like, she would tell them that she was doing either service work or working in some of these factories, but she would not tell them the actual circumstance of her life. Even in 1891, she was going to church with her father, but it was said that she was taking her father to church every Sunday. And he was quite advanced in age in 1891, and he knew nothing about the life that she was living. Now, we've covered James Sadler in this series, so if you want to check that out, you can. We won't talk too much about him here. But it was on the night of February 12th going into February 13th of 1891 that these events happened. But it was said on this particular night that James and Frances were doing what in Australia we would call the pub crawl, going from one place to the next. Now, somewhere along the way, she buys a new hat. Now, the person that sold that hat said that she was 3 sheets in the wind. I'm guessing that's an English term for either being quite loud or perhaps a little bit tipsy, which would be understandable if you had been doing a pub crawl. Coles and Sadler had an argument somewhere after her buying this hat, and they have gone their separate ways. But Sadler and Coles often stayed at Spitalfields Chamber, which was a doss house. Now, Frances has gone back there, and she's passed out drunk at one of the tables. James gets back there after being beaten up and mugged. They ship him off, but they can't seem to get rid of Frances, but she wakes up not long after and also goes back out onto the street because she didn't have the money for the room for the night. But at 1:45 a.m, a very strange event happens. Frances has run into another unfortunate, and this woman describes the bloke that approached both of them as fierce looking with the cheese cutter hat. Now, he propositions her. So Frances's companion, he hits her up. She refuses because she didn't like the look of him. And he punches her. Just straight to the face. But for whatever reason, Frances does not decline the invitation, and off she goes. Now, I would suggest that alcohol played a part in lack of good judgment there for Frances. But it was between 2 and 12 past 2 in the morning that 3 blokes are walking through Swallow's Garden, which was a railway arch, and they see a man and a woman, and the woman had this hat, and they call out, but they don't get a response. But they don't worry about it, and they keep on going. But then it was 2:15, at 2:15, that P.C. Thompson comes across Swallow Gardens, and he hears a bloke running away. And then he gets his light, because it's dark, and he sees the body of Frances Coles. And depending on the reports, it said that she was still alive, and he had to stand there and watch her take her last breath. Because the protocol at the time was if they came across a body, they were not allowed to leave until someone else came along. And he said that haunted him for the rest of his life, because he could have perhaps been pursuing Jack the Ripper. And sadly for this policeman, it was only 10 years later that he himself was attending a big brawl and he got stabbed to death, which is tragic as well. But quite a few police turn up, so only 10 minutes later we've got a couple of policemen, one plainclothes. Chief Inspector Swanson, the lead investigator of Jack the Ripper's there, and later on so is Sir Melville McNaughton. This crime was done, and there was no mutilation like the Ripper crimes, but the papers and the police were thinking about it. They really investigated James Sadler, and they actually charged him with this murder. But the difference between the Ripper crimes and this one was that a blunt knife was used. And oddly, James Sadler sold a blunt knife not long after this event, and they do arrest him. But they actually believed that the knife that he sold wouldn't even been able to inflict these wounds on Francis Coles. But the charges against him weren't dropped because they didn't think that he committed this crime, but rather because they just had insufficient evidence. And there is evidence to suggest that he was elsewhere at 2 a.m., so perhaps justice was done in that case, but he was the only real suspect of the Francis Coles crime. The press hadn't had a good Ripper story for a while, and so they said, look, this could be Return of Jack the Ripper. The police soon shut it down, and surprisingly, this story disappeared very quickly. So going back to 1887 with Fairy Fay, a most likely fictional person but linked to Jack the Ripper crimes, all the way up to Francis Coles in 1891. We see a marked difference in the attitudes of everybody towards these crimes. Early in 1888, 4 to 5 women had been assaulted or murdered. And it only really ramped up in press and public perception when Martha Tabram was murdered. And now she's not considered an official Ripper victim, but when the 5 happened and a crime being publicised in between, the attitudes of people on the street, they were terrified. There was a vigilance committee. People were out to catch this perpetrator. And so were the police. But for whatever reason, after the Mary Kelly crime happened, the police lost all interest. Now, the official word was, we've caught the Ripper. Yet they kept investigating them. Donald Swanson investigated James Sadler when he was arrested for murdering Francis Coles. So if the chief inspector of the Jack the Ripper crimes thought the Ripper had been caught, why did he waste his time? But the purpose of this series was to paint the picture of what life was like for these poor people who were getting attacked or murdered. They were real people, at least 16 of them were, maybe not Fairy Fay. But they had their failings, yes, but don't we all? But they had good hearts, and they certainly did not deserve the treatment meted out to them. So what do you think of this entire series? Let me know down in comments. Did you find it interesting? But just so you know what I'll be doing here on the pub test, yes, we will be continuing the Jack the Ripper Suspects series. There's still more of them to go. Also looking at delving into some other interesting stories as well. But I've also got a little project, and it is to do in the Jack the Ripper vein. Just something different that I'm going to try. And we'll see how that works. So keep an eye out for that when it gets out, probably in about a week's time. I'm just going to do a bit of a test to see how it might go. I really mean it when I say your viewing is truly appreciated, and thank you all for your comments and suggestions as well. I'm Owen, you've been watching the pub test, and we will see you on the next one. And look out for it. It's going to be quite interesting.